Welcome to the channel, Stories of Slavery. Today's story is about 18 Coleman, an enslaved girl in 1868 whose memory helped solve crimes and uncovered an inexplicable, impossible secret that was never meant to be revealed. This is a difficult and intense story, so take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. April 15, 1868, Natchez, Mississippi. 3 years after the war ended, but you wouldn't know it by looking around. The air was thick, heavy with humidity and something else. Fear, the kind that settles into your bones and never quite leaves, the kind that makes you watch your words, watch your step, watch your back. Because the war might be over, but the fight wasn't, not even close. Ada Coleman stood at the window of the judge's mansion, looking out at the Mississippi River in the distance. The water was brown, swollen from spring rains, moving slow and heavy like everything else in this town. She was 22 years old, thin, dark-skinned, quiet, so quiet that most people forgot she was in the room. That was exactly how she liked it. Behind her, in the sitting room, 3 men were talking, planning, scheming. They spoke in low voices, but not low enough. They never were, because they thought Ada was simple, slow, a mute, a former slave who'd stayed on as household help because she had nowhere else to go and no ability to do anything else. They were wrong about all of it, but Ada let them believe, had been letting them believe for 18 years. The men in the sitting room were important, powerful, the kind of men who'd owned people before the war and were trying to figure out how to keep owning them after. Judge Silas Vance was the leader. He was 63 years old, white hair, white beard, dressed in expensive suits that he bought with money he'd stolen. He ran the county courthouse like his personal kingdom, and in many ways it was Reconstruction was supposed to change things. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery in December 1865. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 had granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States. The 14th Amendment was being ratified this very year, 1868, to guarantee equal protection under the law. On paper, everything had changed. In reality, almost nothing had. Mississippi had been readmitted to the Union in February 1868, just 2 months ago. But the state was still controlled by men like Judge Vance, men who'd fought for the Confederacy, men who'd lost the war but refused to lose the peace. They found new ways to maintain control, black codes that criminalized unemployment and vagrancy, then leased convicted black men to plantations as forced labor, voter intimidation, economic coercion, violence. The Ku Klux Klan had been founded in Tennessee in 1865 and had spread through the South like a disease. Mississippi had dozens of active chapters by 1868. Judge Vance had been a plantation owner before the war. 300 acres, 67 enslaved people, worth approximately $180,000, according to the 1860 census. The war had taken all of it. His sons had died at Shiloh and Vicksburg. His plantation had been burned by Union forces in 1863. His slaves had been freed. By 1865, he was worth nothing. Broken, ruined, but not defeated. He'd reinvented himself, presented himself as a moderate, a voice of reason, a man who accepted the new reality and wanted to help guide Mississippi into the future. He'd been appointed as a county judge in 1866 by the military governor, and he'd used that position to build a new empire, one based not on cotton, but on land theft and legal murder. The system was simple. A black man would be accused of a crime, usually something minor, theft, trespassing, talking back to a white man. The trial would be a formality. The jury would be all white. The verdict would be guilty. The sentence would be harsh, prison time or death. Then, while the man was in custody, Judge Vance would approach the family, offer a deal, pay a fine, give up your land, and the sentence would be reduced. Most families, desperate and terrified, would agree. They'd sign papers they couldn't read, transferred deeds they didn't understand, and Judge Vance would add another property to his growing collection. Over 3 years, he'd acquired over 1,200 acres this way. Farms, homesteads, small plots that free people had worked to buy after emancipation. All taken, all legal, all sanctioned by a court system that existed to serve men like him. Ada brought tea into the sitting room. The men barely glanced at her. She set the tray down, poured, served, moved silently, like a ghost, like furniture. The conversation continued without pause. Sheriff William Creddick was there, 48 years old, former Confederate captain. He'd lost an arm at Chickamauga. Now he enforced Judge Vance's will with his remaining hand and a badge that gave him authority to do whatever he wanted. The third man was Thomas Whitmore, a lawyer, young, ambitious, hungry for the power and money that came with serving Judge Vance's interests. They were discussing a problem. A man named Isaac Porter, he was a community leader, owned 75 acres outside town that he'd purchased in 1866 with money he'd saved working as a blacksmith. He'd started a school for black children, was teaching them to read, to write, to understand their rights. He'd helped several families file legal challenges against land seizures. He was dangerous. He had to go. Judge Vance spoke in his soft, cultured voice, the voice of a Southern gentleman, reasonable, educated, deadly. He said Isaac Porter and his son would be taken care of within the week. An accident, a robbery gone wrong, something that couldn't be traced back to anyone in this room. The sheriff nodded. Whitmore took notes. Ada poured more tea. She remembered every word, every pause, every inflection, because Ada Coleman had a condition, a rare neurological phenomenon that medical science in 1868 barely understood. It wouldn't have a name for another century. Hypothymsia, also called highly superior autobiographical memory, a condition where the brain records and stores every experience, every conversation, every moment with perfect clarity. No forgetting, no fading, no mercy. Ada could remember every day of her life since she was 4 years old. Every conversation she'd ever heard, every face she'd ever seen, every word ever spoken in her presence. She could tell you what the weather was like on March 3, 1856, could recite the exact words of a conversation she'd overheard in 1860, could remember the pattern of cracks in the ceiling of the slave quarters where she'd slept as a child. Her mind was a perfect recording device, a library that never stopped adding books, an archive that never forgot. She'd learned early to hide this ability. When she was 6 years old, she'd corrected her mistress about something that had been said 3 months earlier. Word for word, the mistress had been frightened, called Ada unnatural, possessed. Ada had been whipped, locked in a cellar for 2 days. She'd learned her lesson. Never show what you can do. Never let them know you're listening. Never let them know you remember. So she'd become silent, become invisible. Let them think she was simple-minded. Let them speak freely in front of her, and she'd remembered everything. 18 years of secrets, 18 years of crimes, 18 years of confessions, and conspiracies and casual cruelty, all stored perfectly in her mind, waiting. She'd never known what she was waiting for, never had a plan, just survived, just endured, just remembered until April 15th, 1868. That evening, Isaac Porter and his 17-year-old son, David, were found dead on the road outside town, shot multiple times. Their wagon was overturned. Their money was missing. Sheriff Craddock declared it a robbery, said it was probably criminals from out of town, drifters. The investigation would continue, he assured everyone. Justice would be served. 3 days later, a young man named Samuel Turner was arrested. He was 24 years old, a blacksmith. He'd worked for Isaac Porter, learned the trade from him. He'd also been courting Ada in secret. They'd planned to marry to save money and buy a small piece of land to start a life together. Now he was in jail, accused of murdering the man who'd been like a father to him. The evidence was thin. Samuel had no motive. He loved Isaac. He'd been seen in town the night of the murder, miles from where the bodies were found, but that didn't matter. Sheriff Craddock had a witness, a white man who claimed he'd seen Samuel near the scene. The witness was a known drunken criminal, but his word carried weight that Samuel's didn't. The trial was scheduled for April 25th, 10 days away. Everyone knew how it would end. The verdict was already decided. The gallows were being built in the town square. Ada heard all of this in the judge's mansion. She served dinner, cleaned rooms, listened. Judge Vance met with Sheriff Craddock and Thomas Whitmore the night after Samuel's arrest. They laughed, celebrated, called it a clean solution. The troublemaker was dead. His land would be seized for unpaid taxes. His son's death was a bonus. Fewer educated black men meant fewer problems. And the patty was perfect. A blacksmith, young, strong, the kind of man that scared white people, easy to convict, easy to hang. The witness had been paid $50 to lie. The jury was already selected. All white landowners, all loyal to the judge. But they made a mistake. They mentioned details. Specific details, times, locations, who did what, where the bodies were actually killed, which wasn't where they were found, where the real murder weapon was hidden. Judge Vance had been there, had watched, had given the order. Sheriff Craddock had pulled the trigger. Thomas Whitmore had helped move the bodies. They'd planned it together, executed it together, and now they were covering it up together. Ada stood in the corner holding a tray, not moving, not reacting, recording everything. She knew where the murder weapon was buried, behind the judge's stable 3 feet deep, wrapped in oilcloth. She knew the exact words Judge Vance had said when he ordered the killing. She knew the time, the date, the location. She knew the name of the witness who'd been paid to lie. She knew everything. For the first time in her life, Ada realized her curse might be a weapon. Her memory might be the thing that saved Samuel, that brought justice, that destroyed the men who destroyed so many lives. But how? Who would believe her? The word of a black woman against a white judge in Mississippi in 1868. It was impossible. Suicide. They'd call her crazy, lock her up, kill her, unless she found someone from outside, someone who might listen. She remembered a name, a lawyer who'd come through town 3 weeks ago, a white man from Massachusetts. He'd been working with the Freedmen's Bureau, helping former slaves with legal issues. He'd given a speech at the black church, talked about justice, about rights, about the law protecting everyone, not just the powerful. His name was Jonathan Merrick. He was staying at a boarding house on the edge of town. She'd heard Judge Vance mention him with disgust, called him a carpetbagger, a troublemaker, which meant he might be exactly what Ada needed. The next morning, Ada asked permission to visit the market. Judge Vance's wife approved without thinking. Ada was useful, reliable. She'd been with the family since she was 4 years old, born on their plantation, raised in their house. She was trusted in the way that furniture is trusted. To be there, to serve, to cause no trouble. They never suspected she might have thoughts of her own, plans of her own, secrets of her own. Ada walked through Natchez. The town had about 7,000 residents. It had been a major cotton port before the war. Wealthy, prosperous, built on the labor of enslaved people. The war had damaged it, but not destroyed it. The grand mansions still stood on the bluffs overlooking the river. The warehouses still lined the waterfront, but the population had changed. Freed people now lived in the town, worked for wages, voted or tried to. The 1867 Reconstruction Acts had granted black men the right to vote. In theory, in practice, violence and intimidation kept many from the polls. She found the boarding house where Jonathan Merrick was staying. It was a modest building, 2 stories, painted white, run by a widow who rented rooms to travelers. Ada knocked on the door. The landlady answered, looked at Ada with suspicion, asked what she wanted. Ada had prepared for this. She spoke in the slow, simple way that white people expected. Said she needed to talk to the lawyer about a legal matter. The landlord was skeptical but called Merrick down. Jonathan Merrick was 36 years old, tall, thin, serious. He had the look of someone who believed in things, in causes, in justice. He'd come south after the war as part of the Freedmen's Bureau system, had worked with freed people on labor contracts, property disputes, civil rights cases. He'd seen the worst of Reconstruction, the violence, the corruption, the betrayal of promises. But he hadn't given up, hadn't gone home. He was still here, still fighting. He came downstairs and saw Ada, asked how he could help. Ada looked at him, looked at the landlady listening nearby. She needed privacy, needed to speak without witnesses. She said it was about the Samuel Turner case, about the murders, about evidence. Merrick's expression changed. He'd heard about the case. Knew it was a setup, but he had no evidence, no witnesses, no way to challenge it. He told the landlady they needed to speak privately. She objected, said it wasn't proper. A white man alone with a black woman. But Merrick insisted. They went to his room. Once the door was closed, Ada stood there, silent. Merrick waited, asked again how he could help. Asked if she'd seen something, known something. Ada took a breath and spoke, but not in the simple, slow voice she'd used before. She spoke clearly, precisely in her real voice, the voice she'd hidden for 18 years. She said she had evidence, she had everything, but he had to understand something first. She had a condition, an ability, something that would sound impossible, but it was real. Merrick listened as Ada explained. She told him about her memory, about how she remembered everything. He was skeptical. Of course he was. It sounded insane. She expected this, so she offered proof. She asked him to test her. Ask her about any conversation he'd had in Natchez, any public event, anything she might have overheard. Merrick thought he'd given a speech at the Black Church 3 weeks ago. Ada hadn't been there, but she'd heard about it from others who were. That wouldn't prove anything. He needed something private. Then he remembered he'd had a conversation with the boarding house landlady his first morning here about breakfast, about payment, about the rules of the house. It had been in the front parlor. There had been other people around. Maybe Ada had been nearby. Maybe she'd overheard. He asked her to repeat the conversation. Ada closed her eyes, tilted her head slightly, and began to speak, but not in her voice. In the landlady's voice. Perfect, exact. She repeated the entire conversation word for word, including the parts where the landlady had complained about previous boarders. Then she switched to Merrick's voice, repeated his responses, his questions, his agreement to the terms. Then she opened her eyes and switched back to her own voice. She told him the date, April 3rd, the time 18:15 in the morning, the weather overcast, cool. Merrick stared at her. His face had gone pale. He asked her to do it again with something else. He described a meeting he'd had with a local shopkeeper, private, in the back of the store. No one else around. Ada shook her head. She hadn't been. Clear's throat there. Couldn't repeat what she hadn't heard, but she could repeat other things. She told him about a conversation between Judge Vance and Sheriff Craddock that had happened in the judge's study 2 months ago, February 8th. They discussed burning down a black-owned business. She repeated it, every word. In their voices, Merrick's hands were shaking. He realized what he was looking at. A living archive, a perfect witness, the most powerful evidence imaginable and the most dangerous. He asked about Samuel Turner, about the murders. Ada told him everything. She repeated the conversation from April 12th. 3 days before the murders, she spoke in Judge Vance's voice, gave the order, explained the plan. She switched to Sheriff Craddock's voice, confirmed the details, discussed logistics. She became Thomas Whitmore, took notes, suggested how to frame Samuel. Then she told Merrick about the conversation after the murders, where they'd celebrated, where they'd confirmed details, where they'd mentioned hiding the murder weapon, behind the stable, 3 feet deep, wrapped in oilcloth. Merrick listened. His legal mind was racing. This was everything. This would exonerate Samuel, convict the real killers, change everything. But it was also impossible. No court would accept this. It was too strange, too unbelievable. The testimony of a black woman with an impossible ability against powerful white men. They'd call her crazy, demon-possessed, a liar. They'd destroy her credibility. Might kill her. He said this to Ada, said it was too dangerous. She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, had endured too much. She said Samuel would hang in 8 days if they did nothing. She said she'd spent 18 years being silent, being invisible, remembering everything and doing nothing. She was done being silent. Merrick understood he was a lawyer. He believed in the law, in the system, but he also knew the system was broken, corrupt, built to serve power, not justice. But maybe, just maybe, he could use the rules against the people who'd written them. He needed to think, needed to plan, needed to figure out how to get Ada's testimony into court in a way that couldn't be dismissed. He told her to go back to the judge's house, act normal. He would work on the legal strategy, would file motions, would demand to be Samuel's defense attorney, would find a way to make this work. Ada left, walked back through town, back to the mansion, back to her invisible life. But something had changed. She'd spoken. She'd revealed herself. There was no going back. Now, for the first time in 18 years, Ada Coleman had chosen to be seen. Over the next week, Merrick worked frantically. He filed a motion to represent Samuel Turner. Judge Vance denied it, said Samuel already had counsel, a local lawyer appointed by the court, a man who'd done nothing to prepare a defense. Merrick filed an appeal, argued that Samuel had the right to choose his own attorney. The appeal went to a federal circuit judge. Reconstruction meant federal oversight. The federal judge based in Jackson approved the appeal. Merrick was allowed to represent Samuel. Judge Vance was furious, but he couldn't block it. Not without exposing himself, so he agreed. Let the carpetbagger waste his time. Let him mount whatever defense he wanted. The verdict was already decided. The jury was selected. 12 white men, all loyal to the judge, all understanding how things worked. This trial would be a formality. The execution would proceed as planned. The trial began on April 25, 1868. The courthouse was packed. White people filled the main floor. Black people were restricted to the gallery, standing room only. Samuel Turner sat at the defense table, shackled, exhausted. He'd been beaten in custody. Not enough to kill him, just enough to break his spirit. He looked at Ada in the gallery. Their eyes met. She nodded. A tiny movement. No one else noticed. The prosecution was handled by District Attorney Robert Harrison. He was in his 40s, efficient, ruthless. He presented the case quickly. Isaac Porter and his son had been murdered, shot multiple times, their wagon robbed. Samuel Turner had motive. He'd argued with Isaac about money. He'd been in debt. He'd been desperate. A witness placed him near the scene. A white man named Curtis Webb. Webb testified that he'd seen Samuel on the road near where the bodies were found. Testified that Samuel had looked nervous, suspicious. The testimony was vague, inconsistent, but it was from a white man that made it credible in this court. Merrick cross-examined, asked specific questions. What time exactly had Webb seen Samuel? What was Samuel wearing? What was the weather like? Webb's answers were vague, contradictory. He said evening, but couldn't give a time. He said Samuel wore a dark shirt, but witnesses had testified Samuel wore light colors that day. He said it was clear, but weather records showed it had rained that evening. Merrick exposed every contradiction, but it didn't matter. The jury watched with blank faces. They weren't listening to evidence. They were waiting for permission to convict. The prosecution rested. Merrick stood. He called his first witness. He said, "The defense calls Ada Coleman." The courtroom stirred. People didn't know who that was. Judge Vance looked up sharply, recognized the name, saw Ada stand from the gallery. His face went white, then red. He tried to object, said this wasn't on the witness list. Merrick responded that Miss Coleman had only come forward with evidence recently, that he'd filed an emergency motion to add her as a witness that morning, that the federal circuit judge had approved it. Judge Vance's hands gripped the bench, but he couldn't stop it, not without revealing why he was scared. Ada walked to the witness stand. Every eye in the courtroom followed her. White people looked at her with curiosity, confusion. She was just a maid. What could she possibly know? Black people in the gallery watched with hope, with fear, praying this wasn't another trick, another way to hurt them. Ada was sworn in. She placed her hand on the Bible. Swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. She'd been doing that her whole life, just silently. Now it was time to speak. Merrick began gently, asked her to state her name, her age, her occupation. Ada answered clearly. Said she worked as a domestic servant in the household of Judge Silas Vance. A murmur went through the courtroom. Merrick asked how long she'd worked there. Ada said 18 years and she was 4 years old. Asked if she was present in the judge's home on April 12, 1868. Ada said yes. Asked what she heard that evening. Ada said she heard Judge Vance, Sheriff Craytock, and Attorney Whitmore planning a murder. The courtroom exploded. Judge Vance was on his feet shouting, objecting, calling it slander, lies, the ravings of a mentally deficient woman. Merrick remained calm, asked the judge to allow the witness to testify, reminded him that credibility would be for the jury to decide. Judge Vance was trapped. He sat down. His face was purple with rage, but he had to let it continue. Merrick asked Ada to describe what she heard. Ada looked at Judge Vance, looked directly at him for the first time in 18 years, and spoke, but not in her voice, in his. She reproduced the conversation from April 12th, word for word, perfect, exact. She spoke in Judge Vance's cultured Southern accent, his tone, his cadence. She repeated his order to kill Isaac Porter to make it look like a robbery to frame someone expendable. She switched to Sheriff Craddock's voice, rough, direct, confirmed the plan, discussed logistics. She became Thomas Whitmore, young, nervous, taking notes, suggesting Samuel Turner as the sigh. The courtroom was silent, absolutely silent. No one moved. No one breathed. It was impossible. What they were witnessing was impossible. No one could do this. No one could remember conversations word for word. No one could reproduce voices with perfect accuracy. It had to be a trick, a performance. But there was something about it, something in the details, something in the specificity. It felt real. It felt true. Judge Vance tried to interrupt, tried to call it theater, lies. But Merrick wasn't done. He asked Ada to continue. She told them about the conversation after the murders. April the 16th. She repeated it in their voices. Judge Vance celebrating. Sheriff Craddock confirming the bodies had been moved. Whitmore worrying about loose ends. And then the detail that mattered most, the location of the real murder weapon behind Judge Vance's stable, 3 feet deep, wrapped in oilcloth. Merrick turned to the court, said this claim could be verified immediately. Said if a search of the judge's property revealed the murder weapon exactly where Ms. Coleman described it, then her testimony must be considered credible. Judge Vance objected violently, said his property couldn't be searched without a warrant, without probable cause. Merrick pointed out that a credible witness had just testified to the location of evidence in a murder case. That was probable cause. The federal circuit judge, who was observing the trial, agreed. He ordered Sheriff Craddock to conduct the search immediately. The sheriff's face went gray. He tried to argue, but he had no choice. He left with 2 deputies. The trial recessed for 1 hour. The courtroom emptied into the street. The tension was unbearable. Black residents gathered outside praying, hoping. White residents muttered. Some defended the judge. Some were starting to doubt. An hour later, the sheriff returned. He walked slowly like a man going to his own execution. He carried something wrapped in cloth covered in dirt. He presented it to the court, unwrapped it. A pistol, the same caliber as the bullets that killed Isaac and David Porter, hidden exactly where Ada said it would be. The courtroom erupted again. This time, the noise was different. Shock, disbelief, fear. The white people in the crowd were starting to understand. This woman, this invisible servant, knew everything. Everything they'd said, everything they'd done. She was a witness to years of crimes. She was a living record of all their sins, and she was testifying. Merrick asked Ada to continue. She did. She didn't just testify about the Porter murders. She began reaching back, pulling up memories. She testified about a land seizure in 1867, repeated the conversation where Judge Vance and Whitmore had discussed forging documents. She gave dates, names, details. She testified about a black woman named Mary Jenkins who disappeared in 1866, repeated the conversation where Sheriff Craddock had bragged about killing her and dumping her body in the river because she'd witnessed a beating. She gave the location, said the body was weighted down near the old ferry landing. She testified about business deals, bribes, conspiracies. She repeated conversations between Judge Vance and local businessmen, discussed fixing prices, stealing from federal reconstruction funds, paying kickbacks. She gave names, amounts, dates. She became each speaker, reproduced their voices, their exact words. It was devastating, comprehensive, unstoppable. Judge Vance tried to stop her, demanded she be removed, called her possessed, insane, a witch. But the federal judge overruled him, said the witness would be allowed to complete her testimony, said her credibility was remarkable given the verification of her claim about the murder weapon, said this testimony would be entered into the federal record and investigated fully. Ada spoke for 4 hours. She destroyed reputations, exposed crimes, named names. She pulled up memories from 1865, 1860, 1855. She went back to her childhood, to conversations she'd overheard as a slave child. Conversations about selling families, about raping women, about killing men who tried to escape. She spoke in the voices of men who were sitting in that courtroom, men who thought their secrets were safe, men who realized too late that they'd been confessing to a witness all along. The white community in the courtroom split into factions. Some still defended Judge Vance, called Ada a liar, a demon, but others were implicated in her testimony. They started turning on each other, accusing, defending. The social order was collapsing in real time. The black community in the gallery watched in awe, in triumph. This was justice, real justice. Finally, when Ada finished, Merrick had no more questions. The prosecution tried to cross-examine. District Attorney Harrison asked how she could possibly remember so much. Ada explained her condition, said she'd always been this way since childhood, said she remembered everything, every day, every conversation, every moment. Harrison called it impossible, medically impossible. Merrick responded by asking Ada to prove it, asked her to repeat a conversation Harrison had in the courthouse lobby that morning, a private conversation with his Claire. Ada did, word for word in their voices. Harrison went pale. He had no more questions. The jury deliberated for 20 minutes. They returned with a verdict, not guilty. Samuel Turner was free. The courtroom exploded. Black residents cheered, cried, celebrated. White residents were split. Some were furious. Some were in shock. Judge Vance sat at his bench, frozen. His world was ending. His carefully built empire of corruption and violence was collapsing because of one woman who'd been invisible her entire life. But it wasn't over. Ada's testimony had been entered into the federal record. The federal circuit judge ordered immediate investigations. Federal marshals were dispatched from Jackson. They arrived within days. They began making arrests. Thomas Whitmore was arrested for conspiracy to commit murder. He tried to flee but was caught at the state line. Sheriff Craddock was arrested for murder. He resisted, was subdued, locked in his own jail. Judge Vance was removed from the bench pending investigation. He tried to use his influence, his connections, but Ada's testimony had burned those bridges. She'd exposed the corruption of his allies. They abandoned him, turned on him, tried to distance themselves. Within a week, Judge Vance was isolated, alone, ruined. He tried to flee, packed a bag, went to his bank, found his accounts frozen. The federal government had seized his assets pending the investigation. Ada had testified about money laundering, about hidden accounts, about bribes. She'd remembered account numbers, passwords, details that only someone with direct knowledge could know. How did she know? Because she'd been in the room when they were discussed. Because she remembered everything. Everything. Vance tried to buy passage on a riverboat. No one would sell to him. His credit was worthless. His name was poison. He tried to borrow money from associates. They refused. He tried to call in favors. No one answered. Ada's testimony had created a cascade. Everyone implicated was trying to save themselves. No one had time to help a sinking ship. Within 2 weeks, Judge Silas Vance was living in a boarding house on the edge of town, the cheapest one, the kind where drifters and criminals stayed. His mansion had been seized by federal authorities. His land was being redistributed to the families he'd stolen it from. His reputation was destroyed. His power was gone. He was nothing less than nothing. He was a cautionary tale. Ada never saw him again after the trial. She'd moved out of the mansion the same day. Samuel was freed. They'd married quietly. Left Natchez. Too many enemies. Too much danger. The Ku Klux Klan had put a price on Ada's head. $500. Dead or alive. She'd destroyed too many powerful men, exposed too many secrets. She couldn't stay. They traveled north to Memphis, then to St. Louis, then to Chicago, looking for a place where they could start over, where Ada could be anonymous again, where her gift or her curse wouldn't make her a target. They settled in Chicago in late 1868, found work, found community, found safety. But the story followed her. Newspapers picked it up. The woman with perfect memory who'd brought down a corrupt judge, the former slave who'd become the most powerful witness in Mississippi. The articles were sensationalized, exaggerated, but the core was true. Ada Coleman had changed everything, had proven that truth could win, that justice was possible, that one person, one voice could matter. She never testified again, never used her ability publicly. She'd done what she needed to do, saved Samuel, exposed evil. She'd achieved justice, at least partial justice. The system was still corrupt. Reconstruction was still failing. The South was still violent. But she'd won her battle. That was enough. Ada lived in Chicago for the rest of her life. She and Samuel had 4 children. She worked as a seamstress, lived quietly. She never forgot anything, never could. Every day of her life was perfectly preserved in her memory. Every conversation, every face, every moment. It was exhausting, overwhelming, a curse that never lifted. But it was also her identity, her gift, her burden. She remembered the trial, remembered Judge Vance's face when he realized what she was, what she could do, remembered the moment his power broke, remembered the feeling of finally being heard. After 18 years of silence, 18 years of invisibility, she'd spoken, and the world had listened. Years later, in 1895, a researcher from the University of Chicago came to interview her. He'd heard about her ability, wanted to study it, document it. He brought tests, memory exercises, tried to verify her claims. Ada agreed. She was older now, 50 years old, but her memory was as sharp as ever. She passed every test, recalled conversations from decades ago, reproduced voices, gave details that could be verified through historical records. The researcher was amazed. He wrote a paper about her, called her case unprecedented in medical literature. The paper was published in an obscure academic journal. Few people read it. But it was the first scientific documentation of hypothermia decades before the condition would be formally named. Judge Silas Vance died in 1872, 4 years after the trial. He died alone, poor, forgotten. No one came to his funeral. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a porpoise cemetery outside Natchez. His name was removed from public buildings. His legacy was erased. He became a footnote, a warning, a symbol of the corruption of Reconstruction. Sheriff William Creedick was convicted of murder in federal court in 1869. He was sentenced to hang. The execution was carried out in Jackson, Mississippi in August 1869. A crowd of over 2,000 people watched. Most were black. They came to see justice, real justice. For once, Thomas Whitmore, turned state's witness, testified against others involved in Judge Vance's network, was given immunity in exchange for his cooperation. He left Mississippi after the trials, went west, changed his name, disappeared into history. Samuel Turner became a successful blacksmith in Chicago. He and Ada lived modestly but comfortably. They were active in their church and their community. They raised their children to value education, justice, truth. Their descendants spread across the country, became teachers, lawyers, activists, carrying forward the legacy of courage that Ada had demonstrated in 1868. Ada died in 1919. She was 73 years old. She'd lived long enough to see the end of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow, the great migration of black people from south to north. She'd seen progress, seen setbacks, seen the long, slow struggle for justice continue. She'd played her part, had made her contribution, had proved that one person could matter. Her obituary in the Chicago Defender was short. It mentioned her age, her family, her work. It mentioned briefly that she'd been involved in a famous trial in Mississippi decades ago, that she'd helped free an innocent man, that she'd exposed corruption. But it didn't explain how, didn't describe her ability. That detail had been forgotten or perhaps deliberately omitted. Some gifts are too strange, too threatening. Better to let them fade into legend. But the truth remained. Ada Coleman had possessed one of the rarest neurological conditions ever documented. She'd used it to achieve something remarkable. She'd brought down a corrupt system, had saved an innocent life, had struck a blow for justice in a time and place where justice was rare. She'd proven that memory could be a weapon, that truth could win, that silence, when broken at the right moment, could shake the foundations of power. Her story lived on, passed down through her family, through the black community in Natchez who remembered what she'd done, through the legal community who studied the trial as an example of extraordinary testimony, through researchers who documented her case, through historians who recognized her courage. In Natchez today, there's a small historical marker placed by the city in 1995. It stands near the old courthouse where the trial took place. The marker reads, "In memory of Ada Coleman, 1846-1919, witness, truth teller, freedom fighter. Her perfect memory brought justice when justice seemed impossible." The marker doesn't explain how her memory was perfect, doesn't describe her ability in detail, just acknowledges what she did, the impact she made, the courage she showed. That's enough. That's what matters. Because Ada Coleman's story isn't really about a medical condition. It's about what one person can do when they refuse to stay silent, when they choose to speak, when they use whatever gift they have, however strange, however impossible, to fight for what's right. She could have stayed invisible, could have stayed safe, could have let Samuel hang, could have let the corrupt system continue. But she didn't. She spoke, and in speaking, she changed everything. That's the lesson of Ada Coleman. That's the lesson of 1868. The truth is always there. Sometimes it's hidden. Sometimes it's forgotten. Sometimes it's forgotten. Sometimes it's carried by someone invisible. Though when that person finally speaks, when they finally share what they know, the impact can be devastating, can bring down empires, can free the innocent, can remake the world. Her memory was perfect, but her courage was what mattered. Her willingness to step forward, to be seen, to testify, to risk everything for justice. That's what changed history. Not the ability, the choice, the decision to use her gift for something greater than herself, for truth, for justice, for freedom, and somewhere in the vast library of her perfect memory, in that impossible archive that never forgot anything, Ada Coleman remembered it all. The fear, the triumph, the moment she stood in that courtroom and spoke, the moment she became visible, the moment she took back her voice, the moment she proved that one person, one impossible person with an inexplicable gift could change the world. She remembered. She always remembered. And now through her story we remember too.